Zen 5's been out for several months now and it's been unable to gain any traction. Sales have been terrible. Reception has been meh at best. And overall, there just isn't a lot of information out on these CPUs. And this is going to be the 9000 series. So 96, 97, 99, and 9950 are what's currently out. And then rumors have it at the end of this month, the new 3D V-Cache 9800X 3D and so on will be coming out. So hopefully those get a little more exciting. But because they've had such a poor reception, I haven't seen a whole lot of information about how to tune them, what's new, what's different, because people just really haven't cared. So why am I making the video? I think that as time goes on, the old stock sells out, prices readjust to start seeing some sales, and ultimately Intel looks like they're going to come out of the gate with Arrow Lake and do the exact same thing, where performance is going to be completely lackluster. Energy efficiencies and AI cores, whatever we use those for, will be the name of the game. So ultimately, I think that these processors will slowly pick up steam, and there's just not a whole lot of information on how to tune them. So I've been playing around with my 9600 and my 9950 the last couple months, and we're going to look at some of the tips and tricks and I guess secrets that are hidden in the curve shaper and those new BIOS settings. And I only say secrets because there's not a whole lot of information published on it. I mean, even from AMD, I've tried to look up some basic things like, what defines these different states, what are the triggers, things like that. And there's not a whole lot of information on it. But we're going to look at ultimately how have I set up my system for stability and a little extra speed. What do the results look like? And then, was it worth it or not? And what's kind of the optimum level of, taking your time tweaking your computer? And just what can Curve Shaper do for us? So first of all, let's take a look at how we got our BIOS set up. Okay, so first things up, we got an MSI motherboard here. We're using the Mag Tomahawk X670E. So your BIOS, if you're using a different manufacturer, may look a little different. And of note, we do have the newest AGESA, or whatever you want to call it, on here that does support the reduced latency between the CCDs on the dual CCD Ryzen 9 processors. So once we come in here, when we look at performance, I'm going to have three different types of setups. So I'll kind of go through what the basic ones are. The first is if you're just all messed up and you just built your computer, you spent all this money on parts and you didn't know what to do with it, so you just didn't even enter the BIOS. You loaded up Windows and you let it run. So the first is going to be default. Some of the big things here, as you can see, our memory is not even set up. I paid for 8,000 megahertz memory. It's running at 5,600. And then the CPU is going to be held to its default standards. Which the same for AMD and Intel is you need to realize, a lot of people don't realize this, when it shows like, oh, it can do a 5.7 gigahertz boost, that is under perfect conditions on limited cores. So if you expect that you're going to purchase any of these CPUs and just load up any program and just see all the cores lock in at its max boost, that is absolutely not going to happen. And, the days are gone where you could just set a massive overclock, like, hey, the boost was 4.6. I'm going to just lock everything at 5 gigahertz all core. Those days are almost completely gone. They are gone, unless you're using our old hardware. So what we're going to be looking at today is PBO, and specifically on the Zen 5, the new PBO options, including the curve shaper, and then how I think you can best utilize them. So once again, our first is just going to be default. Our second is just going to be a basic, because AMD advertises back in the day, one click, you enable PBO and you're good to go. So we'll try that, see what that does for us. And then we'll go into our actual, our manual PBO settings. So if you're in MSI, you'll probably start up, this is the easy mode first. Immediately you're going to want to go to advanced. Default is just that, default. So the next thing up that I would do is OC. If you're on normal, you'll just go ahead and set it to expert. And for our second one, it's just going to be XMP and PBO just enabled. So XMP is generally Intel profile, you have Expo on AMD, but I didn't get Expo kit. I got an XMP kit, and AMD can still run it. So we'll go profile 1. That's going to load up the 8,000 mega transfers. We just leave everything auto, and it's going to be running CL38 at 1.4 volts. So for PBO, you just go into CPU, what was that? Advanced CPU configuration, AMD overclocking, precision boost overdrive, and enabled. That would just be my situation 2 when we get into the results, and that's it. We enabled XMP and we enabled PBO. That's what AMD, originally advertised what all we need to do. So that's going to be scenario 2. And then scenario 3, this is when we're getting into our meat and potatoes and look at what we're actually going to do. So some motherboards, they come in here and they have some, pre-spun configurations. They're usually like pretty self-explanatory, like, hey, I'm going to set different thermal points. But I'm not a huge fan of these because like some of them, you can try to look it up, but it's going to depend on what board and what CPU you have, like enhanced mode 1, 2, 3, enhanced mode boost. Like that doesn't really tell me much. So bottom line, I always recommend you set it up yourself. So you go to advanced. For PBO limits, I'm just going to set these initially to motherboard. So it'll just pull as much as it can out of that processor. And it is what it is. For scalar, I just don't want anything to draw me back. I'll take a look at it long term to see if there's any negatives. Basically, it's going to accept some of its thermals and different restrictions a little bit longer than it normally would and allow it to continue to run at its boost. So technically that could lead to degradation over time, but as long as you keep them cool, I've never really seen that have a big impact, or I haven't kept a processor long enough, I guess, to really see an impact there. CPU boost clock override. I'm going to give you some of the basics, but this is not like a full PBO. I want to really focus on the curve shaper. But basically, boost clock override, this is raising your F max. So nowhere in here are we actually overclocking the CPU in the sense of like we're telling you I want you to run this frequency. We're just tweaking the rules in which it operates. So CPUs have gotten so advanced these days, for its own protection and for the max performance, it's best to just let it do its thing. But we can tweak the rules, and that's exactly what PBO is doing. So when you raise the F max, that's what this max CPU boost clock override is. It allows it, if the circumstances are there, to boost up to 200 megahertz higher, and that's going to be the limit for the processor. It's going to limit you to 200. If you go 400, it just goes back to 200. So once again, we're not increasing the actual megahertz, we're just allowing it to boost higher than it would from the factory. GPU boost clock, we've got a dedicated video card, so we don't need to worry about any of that. Same curve optimizer for the graphics, don't need to do that. And then we got curve optimizer, curve shaper. So this is going to be my first tip, is when I started playing with this, I was like, oh, curve optimizer is dead, long live curve shaper. And I'll just show it to you here real quick. Hopefully they eventually get a graphical interface for this, but it's not there yet, at least for MSI. But basically, you've got all these scenarios. So like minimum frequency, low frequency, medium, high, max, and then all these temperatures. So my first trick or secret here is I assumed curve optimizer was dead and I would just use curve shaper. I tried to do this for way too long. You can just use curve shaper, but then you have to tune every one of these points. And I would almost argue that like if you truly took the time, you could probably go all the way in shaper and get it perfect. But I already spent way too much time on it. And the thing is, there's so many different scenarios. So like I would think I had it tuned in perfectly because it wouldn't crash at all while I was gaming. and then under some low load circumstance, all of a sudden the computer crashed when I just asked it to like open up the calculator or something. And so then it's like, okay, well now I got to figure out, was that min frequency, low frequency, was that low temp? Like what do I got to tweak with here? So what I would recommend is you back up, and first we find what is our stable all core curve optimizer. And before Curve Shaper existed, you could kind of really nerd out and go per core and try to find the perfect one for each one. But I just want to get us like the 70% solution. So my first tip is just come in here and find out what is rock solid all core. When I ran mine, I ran it, I already did a lot of testing on the all core negative 15, and we want this to be negative because what you're doing here is you're basically saying that for a given voltage, it's going to produce a higher frequency. So I know we're saying negative, but what that does is it pulls the whole curve down so that it's a higher frequency at a given volt. So that's basically how that works. So by going negative, you would only want to do positive if you were doing something like manually changing either the block rate or like something like that where you're manually changing it. We're not manually changing any frequencies. We're just changing the rules to get the frequencies that we want to see. So bottom line, this is the traditional, like on all my 7000 series, this is what I would do is I would just come in here and at minimum, I would find where I was good on an all core. Generally the lower core count CPUs, like, you know, on a 7600 or 7500, like I can usually rock like negative, 25 to 30, maybe even 35. On the small cores. On the big cores, it's a lot harder to do because the thing is pulling a lot more power, and you can't just indefinitely just keep pushing the frequency higher and higher and higher without it hitting other limits. And also on the small cores, once you get so far negative, you're going to hit that F max frequency anyway, and going more doesn't help you because you're already hitting the F max and you're probably just going to run into instability. So there's kind of a sweet spot there. But bottom line, first of all, the first big takeaway is that Curve Optimizer and Curve Shaper can both work for you. So Curve Optimizer negative 15, now I just know that I already have a little bit of across the board negative curve in there, so it's going to give me a higher frequency per given commanded voltage. And what that does is I don't really care, like, here I'll go into kind of my second like secret or tips is like, what do these mean? And they're not clearly defined, at least that I'm tracking through AMD. So like minimum frequency, the best I can figure is that's like an idle type load. So you would think, oh, it's not requesting much, I could probably go real negative there. It's not worth it, and you're just opening the door for instability. And that's why we set the baseline just negative 15 first, because now we know we got it everywhere. But like when I first started out, I was like, oh, low temperature, min frequency, probably doesn't need much power. I'll just put a big shaper in there. And that was what was leading to just my random lockups on just minuscule tasks. And the other thing is, if you're doing something like if you're just coming out of idle, the chance that you're coming out of idle into like a dead sprint is probably pretty low. Like you're probably just trying to open your program, you're trying to make sure nothing crashes, you're wanting stability. So this is what I look at as like idle. I don't want to crash when it's idle. I want to have a computer that's ready for me when I show up. The low frequency, I mean, that's just what it sounds like. This is going to be like very light loads, or maybe like background tasks. And if you don't know this, in the two CCDs, you have a strong CCD and a weak CCD. And the strong CCD is going to run automatically about 1 to 200 megahertz faster. So that's another thing is when you think like, oh, I got a 5.7 gigahertz processor, no matter what you do, the CCD is going to be stronger than the other. So you're never going to see like all 16 cores running at 5.7, even if you put like the perfect load on it. So your top 8 cores are probably going to, we're hoping to hit that 5.7 all core, maybe a little higher. And then the second, we're looking at like 5.5, 5.6. So the low frequency, maybe that's what's running on your second CCD, because you should be primarily locking, your games to your primary CCD that's running the high frequency, and then you're gonna have the low frequency, lower, maybe just background tasks running on the second one, so it doesn't take away from that performance and it's fully available for your game. Medium is going to be like high core workloads. So this is something that's starting to engage all the cores, multiple cores, a significant amount of the cores. High frequency, as far as I can tell, this is going to be like our all core workloads, which is a little counterintuitive because then you're like, what's max? Max frequency is going to be like that 1 or 2 core absolute blast. So what you'll see is once I have all these settings set up, I never really see 5.8 or 5.9 gigahertz when I'm running these high frequency or medium frequency, like large core workloads, because it's just not able to hit the parameters of the temperature and the loading and everything like that. But it will still, in short bursts, hit 5.8, sometimes even 5.9, because of these max frequency, like especially if it's a low temperature coming out of max frequency, it'll boost 1 to 2 cores. And then if you have something like hardware monitor, it'll cycle what cores it's boosting up there. So if you look, it'll show like the max across the board is 5.8. But when you're actually running something, it's probably going to be more like 5.6, 5.7 is what it's running on all the cores all the time. But anyway, so big takeaway here, the curve optimizer works in conjunction with the curve shaper. And the benefit is I don't have to go through here and do every one of these items. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to go for my max frequency. So this is going to be my 1 or 2 core max boost. I'm just going to go in here and start playing around with it. So I already got negative 15 across the board, so I'll just go negative 5. That's going to give me a negative 20 on the curve in that scenario, the max frequency, high temperature. And the other thing, if you're not tracking, is the higher the temperature, the more voltage it needs to be stable. The lower the temperature, the higher the frequency it can achieve with a lower voltage. So therefore, if you can get the lower temperature, it's gonna enable you to be able to run a stronger curve offset to the negative, which is going to allow you to achieve the higher frequencies. So basically what I go through here, I've already played around with all this, but these are going to be added to the negative 15. So this would be negative 20, negative 20, negative 23. And then as far as these temperatures go, just so you can have an understanding, the high temperature, I believe, is about 90 degrees Celsius. So that's prior to its max, which I believe is 95. So at that point, it's going to start triggering basically to go into that negative 20 because it's 5 plus 15. And then the medium temperature, that's going to be 50 degrees. So just to lay this flat, or sorry, not negative, just 50 degrees. I'm saying negative a lot because of the curve shaper. So 50 degrees Celsius on a 16 core processor that can pull upwards of 250 watts is very challenging. So if you think you're going to grab one of these CPUs and strap on an air cooler or even like a 240 millimeter water cooler, like you're dead wrong. AMD is easier to cool in my experience than Intel, but it still takes a lot. Like I would minimum be rocking a 360 millimeter all-in-one. In my main computer, I have a 420, the Arctic Freezer 3. That thing works great for like 115 bucks. And then, you know, if you're a really crazy guy, which you probably don't need to watch this video if you are, you know, you're looking at, you know, full custom loop or something, which I would say that's aimed more towards like Intel extremists. But anyway, what you do is you just go through here, and what I really want to focus on tuning is these high, medium, and max frequencies, because this is where my gaming loads and where I'm actively trying to do something extremely demanding. This is where all of those loads are held. This min and low, I don't really care, and I've already taken care of them by doing just the blatant curve optimizer. Um, and that's kind of where we're at. And so at this point, we've got XMP on, we've got Precision Boost Overdrive on, we've set it up to make it as free as possible, we've raised the Fmax, and then we've applied our generic curve optimizer at something conservative, and then we've gone in and we've further tuned those high demand workloads with the curve shaper. Kind of for bonus points, other things you can do is, especially with these new CPUs, there seems to be some headroom where you can really start messing around with the F clock, U clock, and MIM clock. So for this, I've got the XMP 8000. What we're going to want to do is probably going to need to increase our SoC so we can start getting some more out of the not the core part of the processor, which can be the stuff that controls like the Infinity Fabric and stuff. There's no way we're going to be able to run one-to-one mode with 8000, so we'll go U clock equals MIM clock divided by 2. So 8000 mega transfers, that in half would be 4000 megahertz, which is what the actual RAM is at, and then divided by 2, because we're MIM clock divided by 2 equals the U clock, is 2000. So now we know we're what all of our speeds are. The last one is the Infinity Fabric. And there's a lot more testing to be done on this from me, but what I like to do is you would think like, oh, just set it 2000, then you're 2000, 2000, 2000, or 2000, 2000, 4000, perfect. But since you got two CCDs that can interact with the memory, I'm finding that there's a little bit of extra performance if you can go ahead and get a little more out of your Infinity Fabric, because the Infinity Fabric has a channel going to each CCD. So I like to run it a little faster. So I've been running at 2200. And then I just go ahead and override the SoC voltage to give myself some stability there. Final thing, the CPU load line. Usually mode 2 or 3 is going to get us good. And we'll set that for the SoC and for the CPU so that the cores and the SoC has a little bit more of a stable voltage. It's going to help basically with stability as we're trying to push this thing. So that's the way I set it up. And I'm just going to go ahead and load it because I didn't go through and waste time doing the entire curve shaper. But I'll load it up, and that's basically everything that I've done. And with that, that's everything in BIOS that you need for pretty much a full custom tune. The only thing that you're going to have to really do by yourself is figure out, A, how far can you push the Infinity Fabric, and if there's anything to be gained from it. Sometimes, at least on the older generations, there was kind of a sweet spot where you didn't want to push it too high, but a little higher would help. And then the curve shaper, once you got your optimizer locked in, you're going to then adjust it, and that's going to take some trial and error. You're going to want to run some practical applications like some of your favorite games, and then I would do some generic like load tests, like maybe Cinebench, different things like that. If you got 3D Mark, load some different stuff like that, and then maybe just like some generic diagnostic tools like OCCT or any of the other favorite ones you can look up online. But if you run all that and you're not seeing any errors, you can just be satisfied, or you continue to try to tweak until you find that bleeding edge. But that's everything that you need to get set up and going on your Ryzen 9000 with the curve shaper and kind of going all through the BIOS and everything you can kind of tweak to get a little more performance. Next up, let's take a look at, did it really make a difference and what did we gain? All right, so let's take a look at the results. First thing up, I ran Cinebench R23. This is a great system to just put a sustained load. I mean, it only runs about a 10-minute cycle or 10-minute cycle, but it puts a sustained load on all cores. And there's a couple different things I wanted to point out on this. Like I discussed before, we're not setting an actual overclock. And when you see that advertised boost, it's only under the conditions of correct temperatures and only a few cores. So if you think you're going to be getting a 5.7 on 16 cores right out of the box for purchasing this processor, AMD is not going to give it to you, and Intel's not either. They both never promise it. It's a, hey, cores can boost up to X amount. The only thing you're really guaranteed is that, base frequency, which nobody ever talks about because usually, not very impressive. So when we look at our results here, what we've got is we've got the curve shaper and PBO tuned, which is everything I showed you previously. And when we're running Cinebench over the 10-minute period, it averaged 5.35 gigahertz. So as you can see, that's significantly under what is advertised, but this is an all-core workload, and the number one hindrance on Cinebench is it is just going to cook that processor because it is just difficult to run. So usually it was pinging off right about 95 degrees, even with that 360 degree all-in-one on there. And as a result, it's just trying to find that frequency that it can really push everything in an all-core workload. Now, of note, that is for the primary CCD. Technically, it's not primary and alternate, but for the stronger one, the other CCD was about 100 megahertz lower on all these tests. So from 5.35 would be the first 8 cores. The second 8 cores would be about 5.25. If we come down and just go just PBO enabled, you're going to see there's some mixed results depending on the test with just PBO enabled. So we did pick up a little bit of frequency over the baseline. So, but it's like less than 1% faster. So my takeaway here, and this is going to hold true across everything, is just enabling PBO is not enough. I mean, sure, it's better than nothing, but you want to really get in there and tweak it because as you can see, the curve shaper and everything tuned and everything set up appropriately in the BIOS like I showed you, it's a 9% performance increase in an all-core workload. Just clicking XMP and PBO on, it's only going to get you less than 1%. And then just interesting to point out for the baseline, just to really beat this dead horse, it's advertised 5.7 gigahertz, but in an all-core workload out of the box, it's only going to run about 5 gigahertz. So that's Cinebench, great representation of a very heavy all-core workload. Next one up, we get into our synthetic benchmarks. So 3D Mark, they have a CPU profile, and I broke it down by thread count because this is where you're going to see some interesting interactions depending on the thread count. So I don't know if it was a fluke or not, but for the max threads, where it's using all physical and logical cores, so 16 cores, 32 threads, the PBO tuned with the curve shaper up 14.5%. That is significant considering it probably took me a couple afternoons to really dial it in, and only that long because I was being too aggressive at first. I was really trying to see what I could do. Once I went with something a little bit more reasonable, it worked out. PBO enabled actually lost performance, so I don't know if that was having to do something with, maybe it was some setting in there was temping it out when it was trying to do all the max threads and it was dialing it back or something. I don't know. But then the baseline there actually beat it. When you go over to 8 threads, you're going to see that, the little bit of megahertz on average that we're picking up, the more threads you have involved, it's additive. So the percentage gets bigger and bigger because every core is doing more work. So when we cut it down to 8 threads, that's just going to be kind of looking at, like probably what does our gaming load look like. Our tune's going to be about 2.6% faster. PBO enabled, I'd call that within margin of error of the baseline. And then we come down to 4 threads, we're about 2% faster. Once again, PBO within margin of error. And then single thread, we're just under 1% faster because we're not getting that performance across all the cores. We're just really targeting one. And what we're really looking at is an extra, couple up to a maximum of 200 megahertz on one core. So not massive, but 1%. Good news is most games take more than one thread, so you're gonna have better than a 1% uplift normally. So that's our all-core workloads and then our synthetic benchmarks. Next, let's get into the gaming results. So I only did 3 games, just kind of what I had installed on this computer already. But kind of a wide variety of super easy to run esport, that's Counter-Strike, Cyberpunk can be real demanding, and then Modern Warfare 3. All these were ran at 1080p. It is on a 4080 Super, so if you did a 4090, you'd probably see a larger margin here. And I do have a 4090, but I built a totally separate system, which is what this one is, and my 4090 is water cooled, so I didn't want to pull it out and put it in there. But that's beside the point. 4080 Super, I did have a bit of an overclock on it to try to just get any difference I could from the CPU and make sure that it wasn't the bottleneck. But here we go. Counter-Strike is a game that loves frequency, and it utilizes the CPU very well. Very tuned game. So as you can see, our PBO tune picked up over 14.5%, which at this point you're getting into the realm of no monitor is even going to display this, but it is cool to see. PBO just enabled about 2.5%, and then baseline is baseline. If we get into Cyberpunk, this was ran at 1080p, all settings high. I think I originally just disabled DLSS, but I guess now instead of just DLSS off, there's like upscaling off and then frame gen off. So I think frame gen might have been on, which is why these numbers are so high. But ultimately, they all got ran the exact same way. So it's still a good data point. And this is ray tracing off, of course. Curve Shaper picked up about 3.5%. PBO enabled picked up 1.9%. And then Modern Warfare 3, basically 3.6 and 2% uplift. So it's not massive, but Modern Warfare 3 is kind of interesting. And this is one point that I want to take a look at. And there's several benchmarks out there that do this. It kind of shows like, here's the theoretical frames, like max frames that the CPU is able to process, and here's like what the GPU is able to process, and then it tells you like how often was the system waiting on the CPU versus the GPU. You generally want your bottleneck to always be on your GPU or just straight up your monitor's refresh rate, because if the CPU starts bottlenecking, it's going to slow the whole system down. That's when you're going to see the 1% lows drop out, and you're going to have some really hard lurching in the game, and it's not going to feel good. So just to show this, if you just go with the default setup down here, the CPU was the bottleneck 17% of the time. So 17% of the time, Modern Warfare was waiting on the CPU to feed the GPU the information that it needed. Just by enabling PBO, that cut it down to 3%, and then by tuning, it cut it down to 0%. Now, I don't think these metrics are perfect in all of these benchmarks, but it does go to show you that if you're like right on the edge, a little bit of tuning can take it so that the computer's waiting on your CPU to your computer's waiting on the GPU, which is really the position that you want to be in. And then as far as, the performance is the performance. That's what really matters. But as far as like, hey, what did we really do to obtain this? Generally, in the default setup, you're on that gaming workload. So it's like the high but not max workload, and it's usually about that medium temperature. We try to keep it around the 50 degrees. Most of these games were right around 50 degrees with the 360 all-in-one on there. And so the baseline during most of the games was running about 5.5 gigahertz. With PBO enabled, it was getting it a little bit higher, probably like 100 megahertz higher. It was around 5.6 or so. And then with it tuned, it was locking in pretty hard. But it was like not perfect 5.7, but it was like 5680 to like 5720. And then every once in a while, it would shoot like a single core up at a time to 5.8. So ultimately, what you're looking at is if you really tune it in a gaming workload, you can get it to run all core at that advertised boost. And it makes a big difference in some games. So, like esports titles, it's going to make a huge difference. Graphically demanding titles, it's not going to make much of a difference. In fact, Cyberpunk with a 4080 Super, I'm probably going to play that 1440p or 4K. And at that point, the CPU's not going to matter at all, which I've covered in other videos. But I still use them as examples of like, hey, this is kind of uplift across, different types of games that you could see. So overall, if you're spending this kind of money, this is a $650 processor. If you're spending this kind of money, to me, you don't just want to slap it together and not know what you're doing. Like, you want to take a minute, really get it tuned, really get it set up so you can get the most out of the system. And hopefully this video kind of shared and explained, some of these enigmas that aren't really defined anywhere, like what is high temperature, what is heavy workload, uh, do these systems work together? That's kind of all the stuff hopefully I answered for you today. And then showed you that there is some performance to be had if you're willing to take the time to tune it. So thanks for giving me a watch today. If you like the content, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe. And good luck building.